Hello, class. It is now time for our read aloud. We are currently reading A Week in the Woods by Andrew Clements. We are now on chapter 16. Chapter 15 left off at a very suspenseful part. Mr. Maxwell had wrongly accused Mark of bringing a knife to camp, and now he goes back to apologize, and Mark is gone. He's not in the truck like he's supposed to be. So here we go. Chapter 16, Into the Woods. Walking back past the gatehouse, Mr. Maxwell forced himself to give the ranger a smile and a thumbs up. But that wasn't how he felt. Mark wasn't in the truck. So the first thing Mr. Maxwell had to do was go to Mark's cabin and see if maybe he'd swung back there. Maybe Mark had forgotten something, or maybe he'd be at the washrooms. That made sense. 15 minutes later, Mr. Maxwell had looked everywhere he could think of: the Raven's Nest, the other cabins, the washrooms, the lodge, the kitchen, the campground roadways, everywhere. Back at the gatehouse, Mr. Maxwell told the ranger that he hadn't found the boy. Then he asked, "Would you have seen him if he went to my truck out there in the lot? I mean, could he have walked past here without you noticing, do you think?" The ranger heard the fear in Mr. Maxwell's voice. He didn't answer right away. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "Bill, are you thinking that this boy's run off? Because if he has, then we've got a real problem. I haven't been sleeping any this afternoon, but if you're asking me could a kid have slipped by here and got down the entrance road and out onto the state highway, then sure, he could have done that. So I'm telling you that we need to jump on this like right now, because we've got some bad possibilities, and then we've got some terrible ones, like if he went out to the highway and somebody picked him up." Mr. Maxwell felt the sweat break out on his forehead. Listen, Jim, give me 20 minutes, okay? I just want to make a quick pass back through the campground, and if I don't get any news, then I'll turn it all over to you, okay?" The ranger rubbed his chin a second or two and then said, 15 minutes. You get back to me in 15 minutes with good news, or I've got to start making phone calls." "Fair enough, Jim. Thanks." And Mr. Maxwell was out the door at a trot. On his first quick search, Mr. Maxwell had been past all the girls' cabins, but he hadn't talked to all the chaperones and teachers, hadn't actually asked if anyone had set eyes on Mark Chelmsley carrying a bright yellow backpack headed toward the parking lots. Now he was asking. The grown-ups in the first three cabins hadn't seen a thing. Then in the Pine Cove cabin he talked with Mrs. Leghorn. She was sitting in a chair close to the wood stove, her long red coat tucked around her legs, her stainless steel coffee cup in her gloved hands. "Mark?" she said. "Yes, I saw him. I was walking to the kitchen for some coffee, and he went across the path. Had that big thing on his back." Mr. Maxwell's heart took a leap, but he kept his voice calm and low. "Were you at the lodge when you saw him?" Mrs. Leghorn shook her head. "Not quite. I was almost to the council clearing in the woods on this side of it." Motioning with her hand, she said, "I was walking this way, toward the lodge, and he cut across ahead of me at the near end of the clearing. Kind of going that way." Mr. Maxwell leaned forward. "You're sure about that? He wasn't walking toward the road?" Mrs. Leghorn shook her head. "No, I'm sure. He wasn't headed toward the road at all." Mr. Maxwell knew Gray's Notch State Park almost as well as he knew his own 45 acres, and he knew that if Mrs. Leghorn and Mark had crossed paths where she said they had, and if Mark hadn't been heading for the road, there was only one other place he could have been going. Mr. Maxwell said, "Listen, Elsa, I need you to do something for me, right now, okay? I need you to walk to the gatehouse as quickly as you can and tell the ranger that I found Mark, all right?" Taking a last sip of coffee, Mrs. Leghorn stood up and said, "Of course, Bill. Was he lost or something?" Mr. Maxwell nodded. "Sort of. Tell Jim, that's the ranger. Tell him that Mark walked up the Barker Falls trail, and that I've gone to fetch him, and that we'll be back soon, all right? Got that?" The math teacher nodded. "Barker Falls trail." Mr. Maxwell said, "Right." And with that he turned, rushed out the door, veered to the left, and began jogging toward the trailhead at the east edge of the council clearing. Mark eased himself down until he was sitting on a boulder, his breath coming in rough gasps. For more than an hour he'd been pushing himself pretty hard. He unhooked the straps, shrugged off his pack, then bent down to get a water bottle. Unscrewing the cap, he took a long drink. Right away he wished he hadn't. I should probably be more careful with my water. He dug into his pack and pulled out an energy bar. He opened the end of the wrapper, took one bite, then carefully tucked it away again. Mark was in good shape, so it didn't take him long to catch his breath. After about 2 minutes, he stood up and stretched. His right heel felt a little warm, but he didn't think it was starting to blister. Besides, there was no time for first aid, not now. He picked up his pack, settled the pads on his shoulders, fastened the strap across his chest, and then snapped the buckle of the waist belt. He looked back at the rocky ravine he had just climbed, and then ahead into the pines and the leafless groves of maple and birch that covered the rising ground on both sides of the trail. Suddenly, Mark felt small. It wasn't like feeling small compared to another kid. It wasn't like feeling small in the crowd during a Knicks game at Madison Square Garden. This was different, a new kind of small. High overhead a crow called, and Mark tipped his face up to scan the gray sky above the treetops. A second crow answered the first, and he saw them both, winging north. "Where is that east?" he asked himself. Mark wasn't sure. He almost reached for his compass, because then he could figure it out. Wouldn't be hard to do. Then he could at least be sure of something. Because Mark wasn't sure of much at that moment. He wasn't sure if anyone would find him. He wasn't sure if anyone was looking yet. He wasn't sure how far he had walked since the last trail marker. But glancing at his watch, he was suddenly sure of one thing. It was 2 minutes after 4, and if anyone was coming after him, he didn't have time to be standing around. Mark turned and started walking uphill again. "I'll get in less trouble than you would." That's what Mark had whispered to Jason in the Raven's Nest, and at that moment, Mark felt sure it was true. This whole thing is stupid anyway. It's not like I was waving the knife around or trying to kill someone with it. I didn't even know the thing had a blade. And if Mr. Maxwell had found Jason with it, would Jason be getting sent home? No way. This is about me and Mr. Maxwell. Mark had felt sure of that too. And how much trouble am I really in? After all, this isn't even my school, not really, or my town. Suspended for a week? Or even for the rest of the year? So what? That's what Mark had told himself in the cabin as he rolled his sleeping bag and gathered his things. But when he had gotten outside, when he had started walking toward the parking lot, Mark didn't feel so confident. Walking on the path, dragging his boots on the ground, scraping up a small heap of pine needles with every step, Mark felt the weight of the situation pressing in from all sides. What are Mom and Dad going to say about this? He asked himself. And what if Mr. Maxwell or the principal calls Runyon Academy? What then? And then there was the fact that he was going to miss the whole week in the woods. Walking on the roadway now, a deep wave of self-pity surged up in Mark's chest, and he had to gulp hard to keep from letting out a sob. "It's not fair," he raged, and the feeling was so intense that for a moment Mark thought he had screamed the words out loud. Then a thought stopped him in his tracks. "I've got to go and wait in Mr. Maxwell's truck? That's because he's going to drive me home himself. He wants to. He wants to rub it in and watch me squirm all the way home." Turning to his right, Mark looked around. There was no one in sight. Then at the edge of the council clearing, Mark saw the big brown display board he had looked at earlier during the scavenger hunt. It was the starting point of a 10-mile trail that went up to a waterfall. Mark walked toward the trailhead, his stride getting longer and more purposeful with every step. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter, didn't slow his pace. And as he passed the display board and saw the first red trail marker nailed to a tree 20 yards ahead, he said to himself, "If Mr. Maxwell wants to get rid of me so bad, then he's going to have to find me first." That's the end of chapter 16. Until tomorrow.